Try this again. Lamar Waldron is on the line with us. He is the author, most recently, of Watergate, The Hidden History of Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. I shouldn't say most recently, most relevantly, the definitive biography of, what happened during the tail end of the Nixon years and throughout, actually, the Nixon years. And so, Lamar, you were telling us that Nixon declared the war on drugs 50 years ago today, in part because 10 to 20% of the Americans coming back from Vietnam are coming back as heroin addicts, and heroin addiction, thus, was spreading across the country and getting all kinds of publicity. Where do we go from there?
And that's exactly right. Two important points to note, though. One is, in Nixon's first year in office, after he stole the 68 election, many people would say by committing treason, he had the military crack down on marijuana use in Vietnam. So there was a bizarre situation where, in many cases, it was easier for a soldier over there to get heroin to help him relax than it was to get marijuana, which is just ridiculous, that they cracked down on marijuana like that. The other thing being, the reason it was so easy to get heroin over there was because it was being sold through the government-funded service clubs where the soldiers would go for their R&R, their rest and recreation.
Not officially.
Well, that was another scandal that started raising up, and it was called the Service Club scandal. Now, it wasn't officially like, give me a Coke and some smack. It wasn't like that, but it was so incredibly widespread that became its own scandal. So you might wonder why or how, would heroin be sold so readily in service clubs throughout Vietnam and the adjacent countries like Thailand and stuff? Well, the guy who handled getting the heroin into those service clubs worked for the number one godfather that Richard Nixon had a relationship with at that time, a guy by the name of Santo Trafficante.
Oh, my God, the guy who ordered the hit on John Kennedy.
Well, who admitted he ordered the hit on John Kennedy, and whose father created what your older listeners, like you and I, will remember, something called the French Connection. And the French Connection was how the heroin was trafficked from the Middle East and then through France and Marseille and then into the United States, sometimes smuggled on cars and stuff like that. Yeah. And so, so Trafficante had been a big supporter of Richard Nixon since the 1960 election, when Trafficante and his heroin partner in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, named Carlos Marcello, they gave Nixon in the 60 campaign $1 million bribe, basically, to keep Hoffa out of prison, to help Nixon get elected, because Nixon was like the Mafia's guy. The Mafia had free reign in the United States and Cuba in the 50s. The Kennedys... When
Nixon was vice president.
Right, when Nixon was vice president. Eisenhower, who wasn't in the greatest health for a lot of, especially the latter part of his term, was the president. And it was only Senator John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who helped to spearhead these Senate hearings, that got any attention all on the Mafia and on particular people like Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and Jimmy Hoffa in the late 50s. That's how JFK became a presidential candidate. So Trafficante had a long tie-in with Nixon. Part of that deal in '60 involved the CIA Mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro right before the election. So it's like a package deal. So Nixon had been working with Trafficante then. At the very time he's declaring war on drugs, two things Nixon is up to. One, he's negotiating another $1 million bribe from Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. This was all confirmed by Time magazine several years after the events. And that would be to release Jimmy Hoffa from prison but not let him resume control of the Teamsters, because Hoffa was a powerful figure, right?
Right.
And Trafficante and Marcello and the other mobsters, they liked the guy that Frank Fitzsimmons, who was like a pushover compared to Jimmy Hoffa. So they didn't want Hoffa
which is why they
back
vanished
running
him.
the Teamsters. So there was $1 million bribe being negotiated, and here's the worst part of all. I mean, this just puts Nixon up in the pantheon and may make him worse than Trump. Only history will tell. Alexander Haig became Nixon's last chief of staff, General Alexander Haig, later Secretary of State, if you recall, under Ronald Reagan. Alexander Haig, was a conservative guy, right? He was a career military guy. He discovered that Richard Nixon was getting regular, pretty much monthly briefcases full of cash from Southeast Asia that were originating with the people working with Trafficante, trafficking the heroin through the service clubs. So Nixon was literally, and Haig didn't want to believe that. So he went to what I believe, and your veteran listeners will know this better than I think it was called back then something like the Criminal Investigative Service or something like that with the Army. It was their NCIS, basically.
Right.
And Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's last chief of staff, but he was also still a general, he was able to get someone assigned to him to basically follow the guy who was bringing these monthly briefcases full of cash to Nixon, to follow that guy back and then follow him back to the U.S. And so he literally, Alexander Haig, was able to confirm this. Now, the problem for your listeners is that most of them have never heard this. So why haven't they heard it? Well, it was literally front-page news in a lot of major American newspapers 2 years and 4 months after Nixon's resignation. And people who didn't live through it, like you and I did, I mean, people were so tired of Nixon and Watergate, just like people are tired of Trump in many ways. After all that stuff, they just wanted to move on. So
amazing.
So
Lamar, can you stick around?
Sure.
We got Watergate, the hidden history, which is a really serious book. I'm holding it in my hand. It's like a large brick. And so, Lamar, so we've got Richard Nixon involved with Trafficante and Marcello, who were running heroin into Vietnam and addicting 10 to 20% of our U.S. returning service members in 1971. And then Trafficante and Marcello sending literally suitcases full of money every month to the White House, to Richard Nixon, to keep this thing going. And Al Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, the general, finding out about it and freaking out. What next? From there to the actual declaration 50 years ago today. And by the way, 50 years ago yesterday was the anniversary of the Watergate break-in, the principal title of your book, Watergate: The Hidden History.
Which, by the way, occurred almost exactly a year after Nixon declared the war on drugs. I mean, that was one busy year.
Yes, yeah. If I said before, I meant after. So where do we go from Nixon's in the White House? He's getting bribes from these two mafia godfathers who are running heroin into Southeast Asia, specifically to sell it through the service clubs to American GIs, which is producing 20% of returning GIs being addicted to heroin, which is producing a heroin epidemic in the United States that presumably Trafficante and Marcello are more than happy to meet the need of. Where do we go from that point that you've so well established to his declaration of the war on drugs and the actual implementation of it, and John Ehrlichman's later comments about it?
Well, of course, in 71, when he makes that declaration in June, Nixon was the kind of guy who was always running for re-election. I mean, he literally always was running. So he's got his eye on the 72 election then. And as one of his two top aides, there were Haldeman and Ehrlichman, John Ehrlichman, told a journalist in 1994, he said that the Nixon White House, after Nixon got in, had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. Now that's a quote. Okay, I'm reading you the quote right now. And he told this journalist in 1994, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," close quote, because they weren't going to vote for Nixon anyway.
Right.
So that incredible amount of racism, because, of course, Nixon was able to steal the 68 election. He got it close enough so his treason worked by using racism, using what was called then and is called now the Southern strategy, which is now the de facto way that Republicans gin up votes.
It's basically racism. All the GOP has anymore.
Well, that's exactly right.
I mean, we saw this yesterday with Roy Blunt when he came out and said, it's not the Joe Manchin compromise anymore. It's the Stacey Abrams, let's put a black woman in front of, it's like, come on, racist much, Senator Blunt? Anyhow, back to you, Lamar. Sorry.
But again, remember, it worked for Nixon in 68, and Nixon, even though the 72 election was more than 4 months after the Watergate arrest, that were front page news in every major daily newspaper in the country, right? So it wasn't like people didn't know that Watergate happened. People knew it happened. They knew people involved with the White House were arrested for it. I mean, it was just pretty clear who benefited, and yet Nixon won the 72 election in a massive landslide.
Right.
So Republicans are using the same tricks that Nixon used in the 72 election, in the 68 election, but he got 68 close enough to steal, and he won 72 overwhelming. So your listeners should kind of keep that in mind. But I have to say, it actually gets worse. So he's using racism and this war on drugs basically as a political tool to help him get reelected, in addition to the plumbers, who were one of several groups he had that were doing all sorts of felonies and break-ins. And, I mean, it was just a massive criminal enterprise, the whole Nixon administration, which is why 60 people were indicted or convicted or pled guilty, and two of his attorneys general, would be convicted. One would go to prison. So, but it actually gets worse than all this, okay? It actually gets worse. So let's zip through Watergate and get right up to Nixon is being pressured to resign. I think there's a very good case to be made that Al Haig's knowledge of the secret monthly bribes from the heroin trafficking to our servicemen and women in Southeast Asia, I think that Al Haig was able to use that, and I outlined the circumstantial case, to get Nixon to resign and to forge that deal for a pardon. Because Nixon knew he needed that pardon. I think the deal was cut for the pardon even before, and there was circumstantial evidence to back it up. So, and get this, Nixon was, when he was debating whether or not to resign, he hadn't decided yet in July of 74. And so when he was debating whether or not to resign, and resisting it, by the way, he was looking at spending millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to refurbish a big Florida mansion to serve as a better winter White House for him. And that big Florida mansion was called Mar-a-Lago.
Oh, my God.
So, I mean, the parallels to Trump are just ridiculous. But
well, Roger Stone was in tight with Nixon at that point in time, as was Roy Cohn, and those two guys have been with Trump for throughout his political career. Well, Roy Cohn is dead, but Roy Cohn was his lawyer back in the day.
Nixon was the first person to predict that Donald Trump would be president one day, because Roger Stone introduced Nixon to Donald Trump. I think it was around 1980. Trump was using Roy Cohn, was literally Trump's number one mentor. I mean, Trump admits that. So this festering disease from that war on drugs that, it just keeps cropping up. And it would crop up again in the 80s. But even before we get to that, there were murders involved in all of this. So remember I said
what?
There were murders involved in all of this. So remember, Nixon's ties to Trafficante go back to 1960s. Nixon's ties to the Mafia go back to his first run for Congress back in 1946 with the L.A. Mafia and Mickey Cohen. But his ties to Trafficante go back to 1960 and that election and the CIA Mafia plots and that involved Marcello and a Chicago mob boss, not a godfather, by the name of Sam Giancana, and Giancana's man in Hollywood and Las Vegas by the name of Johnny Roselli. Well, after Nixon finally resigns and he gets his pardon, Congress finally gets wind of these CIA Mafia plots, and they're starting to dig into it.
These are plots to kill Castro.
Right, to kill Castro. A senator by the name of Frank Church, and on his committee is Gary Hart, and Richard Schweiker. And so, they're starting to dig into this, and they're subpoenaing people like Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli to testify. And by the way, Jimmy Hoffa had a small role in those plots as well, and we've talked about the big bribes, the two different $1 million bribes about Hoffa. So, and they're talking about subpoenaing Hoffa as well. Well, guess what happens to Sam Giancana before he can testify? He's murdered in a hit that's connected to Santo Trafficante. And then just a matter of weeks after Sam Giancana is murdered, and that was front page news across America, because most people had just found out about these CIA Mafia plots. And then Jimmy Hoffa disappears before he can testify, and his disappearance is linked to Santo Trafficante. And then after Johnny Roselli has very carefully testified and tried to avoid angering Santo Trafficante and Marcello, but eventually he just keeps getting dragged back before that committee for secret testimony. But it's known. It's in executive session, the same way that Trump's White House attorney
Don McGahn, yeah.
Yeah, the way he just testified. So he testified, just it wasn't on TV. And so Johnny Roselli, he vanishes right after a meeting, just within days of his last meeting with Santo Trafficante, and then his body, the Senate witness, I think he's one of the first Senate witnesses ever murdered, is found, floating, dismembered and floating in a 55-gallon oil drum. And so that even has an effect. Now, that does have an effect on Richard Nixon. So a year after Nixon had resigned and flown off in his helicopter and stuff like that, Nixon finally reemerges from seclusion in a very public way at a golf tournament in Southern California, where Nixon is playing golf with the two top suspects in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, and this is just within a couple of months after Hoffa was murdered. So, did Nixon love the money he was getting from Trafficante for all the heroin and all the drugs? Sure, but he knew what Trafficante was capable of. I don't think he knew details, but I think he knew that.
So Nixon thought his life was at risk if he squealed, basically?
Exactly. So you make nice by playing golf with these two close associates of Santo Trafficante in public at this golf course. And I tell you, when you read like the New York Times article about that golf tournament, or Stephen Ambrose wrote this mostly pretty good, except he left out a lot of the Mafia, 3-volume biography of Nixon. When you read the Times or the Ambrose 3-volume biography of Nixon, it just like comes out of the blue. It's like and it didn't really penetrate the national consciousness because it was just so bizarre.
Right.
Why would Nixon? But you're exactly right. He didn't want to get killed. He wanted to show he was going to keep his mouth shut and play nice, and he did. So Nixon had a guy. Nixon's best friend was a Mafia associate named Bibi Rebozo, who had a little private bank down in Miami that basically only serviced, Mafia-type people, and they did business with Switzerland. So while Nixon was president, all this illicit money was held and laundered by the mob associate, best friend of Nixon, B.B. Rebozo. And then after Nixon is no longer president and he's kind of away from that spotlight, you and I know, a good investigative journalist in many ways by the name of Anthony Summers was able to document that Nixon started making annual trips to Switzerland to go check on his money at this Swiss bank.
Whoa.
So,
Lamar,
Nixon,
can you stick around for a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
There's some more great stuff to tell you.
Okay, we're hitting a break here. It's 48 minutes past the hour. We will be back with Lamar Waldron, his book, Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. And welcome back. So, Lamar, we will recap after the break for our Sirius XM listeners, but give me keep going.
Well, so by the end of the 70s, Nixon's in great shape. He's living in that incredible spread overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He's got his money that his best friend had kept for him. He stayed out of jail. He's seen a new Republican president get elected, and vice president, and
Reagan.
and Bush, and so he's looking pretty good. But I think it's really important to note a lot of your listeners, I hope, are aware of something called the cocaine-Contra scandal, part of the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And that was where the death squads that Reagan and Bush were backing down in Nicaragua and Central America and El Salvador were basically raising money and making money on the side by smuggling drugs. And so in many ways, what Nixon did in the early 70s with his drug deals with Trafficante, I think really laid the groundwork for what happened with the CIA-sanctioned drug dealing in the mid-'80s, because a lot of the Cuban exiles who were involved in those activities had literally worked for Nixon and his campaign and his dirty tricks operation.
Right, and let's be very clear: the Nixon Mafia CIA plots to assassinate Castro had one main purpose, which was to reinstall the Mafia back in charge of the island of Cuba.
Exactly right. Well, to make Nixon president, because we'd have U.S. troops fighting in Cuba, and who's going to vote for that young, inexperienced JFK?
Right.
When you had this 8-year vice president, and you're exactly right. It would put the Mafia back in charge with their
specifically Trafficante.
Right, and he was the biggest casino owner in Cuba once they ran out Meyer Lansky. But many of the Cuban exiles involved, and some of the CIA agents involved in the Iran-Contra affair and the cocaine smuggling aspects of it, they trace all the way back to the CIA Mafia plots, and also were involved with Nixon's dirty tricks, and I hate to call them dirty tricks teams, during the Watergate era, his political felonies teams.
Right.
And so, when these things don't get exposed enough, and dragged out into the sunlight, these things just keep coming up and coming up. So Nixon and everything he did with his phony war on drugs laid that groundwork for the cocaine-Contra stuff with Reagan and Bush in the 80s and into the early 90s. And then, you can draw that path right to Donald Trump, who used all of the techniques that Roger Stone and Roy Cohn learned from Nixon, the thing that you and I have talked about in past shows called FIBS, fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. That's how Nixon got elected. That's how Trump was able to steal the election and almost stole the 2020 election. Yeah. And so, that's why I just love to try to drag these things out into the light.
It's amazing. We'll pick this up in literally 1 minute. Welcome back. Lamar Waldron, the author of Watergate, The Hidden History, the definitive book on Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. is on the line with us. So So Lamar, just to recap, Nixon was mobbed up. He was sponsored by the Mafia back in the 50s when he first ran for Congress, or in the 40s, in 46. Right. The Mafia was with him throughout his time as vice president. The Mafia was helping him in the 1960 election against John Kennedy to try to assassinate Castro, because he was getting whacked by Kennedy for letting Cuba go communist. The Mafia, Trafficante and Marcello specifically, were importing heroin into Vietnam and giving cash, literally monthly suitcases full of cash, to Richard Nixon in the White House. And Nixon Nixon, is using the Southern strategy, racism, and all this stuff. How does this relate to today, to the Donald Trump strategy? It seems like a lot of these same people who were involved in trying to execute Castro in the 1960s for Nixon's election, and then later became part of George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan's Iran-Contra scandals, are now popping up around Donald Trump. I mean, what's going on here? What's the connection between these things? We have about 2 minutes.
Well, and remember, there were literally people who were involved in or accused of being involved with Iran-Contra. I mean, Elliot Abrams and others who Trump was dragging these people back into government after, decent people had said they shouldn't be involved in government anymore. And again, it does boil down to that strategy: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear that started out in the late 40s. I mean, that's what Nixon used. That's what Joe McCarthy used. By the way, Joe McCarthy, there was another big heroin kind of surge in the mid-50s, thanks to Nixon, and the Mafia there. Joe McCarthy, by the way, was a morphine addict, according to the head of the Bureau of Narcotics at the time. So again, just the incredible ironies there. And I can tell you one other bit of news that I haven't said anywhere else. F. Lee Bailey recently died, the famous
We
attorney.
had dinner with him a couple of years ago, Louise and I.
Her
Her father knew him. Her father prosecuted his client, and they became friends.
Interesting. So F. Lee Bailey was making F. Lee Bailey represented one of the Watergate burglars, James McCord. F. Lee Bailey was making regular payphone calls to Santo Trafficante,
oh my God,
reporting on the progress of the Watergate trials. But F. Lee Bailey was also on retainer by the CIA. So in other words, it's those CIA Mafia plots, and F. Lee Bailey kept that secret, and I just kind of hint about that in the book. By the way, if you're
Lamar, I'm sorry, we're off the air. We're out of time.